Hello, I'm David Legge. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about trade and global health, although modern trade agreements are much more than simply the trade in goods. They are as much about economic integration as they are about what we used to call trade, and they have huge implications for public health. I'll talk about the WTO agreements and then talk about the free trade agreements, so-called, which have followed the WTO. I really hope you find it useful. My focus in this presentation is on these kind of questions about trade relations. How do trade relations affect health? And I'm making a distinction between trade relations, which is about what is exchanged and how much money is paid for it and so forth, and trade negotiations, which is the process of discussing rules, and trade agreements. So staying with trade relations first of all, how and when are trade relations mutually beneficial or not? Why and when are agreed trade rules desirable? When do trade relations morph into economic integration? What kinds of trade policies do governments pursue and why? What is the significance of trade agreements in terms of health policy? And finally, what do public health policy folk need to know about trade agreements? So first of all, how and when are trade agreements beneficial? If you look at the right-hand column, you can look that in part it's about the substances being traded and the circumstances under which trade is being done. Trade in slaves is probably not mutually beneficial, although presumably the elites who are willing to sell people into slavery are getting some benefit from it. The trade in arms has got definite winners and losers. The trade in opium in the 19th century was forced on the Chinese by the British and the European and Americans. Clearly the Chinese were the losers. The trade in tobacco clearly has got winners and losers on both sides of the border, but the losers, half the losers will die. And then junk food. So the content of the trade is important, but likewise the power relations between the trading partners. So if we look at trading agreements between Australia and New Zealand, or where the two countries are relatively equal, trade agreements between Australia and China, where we very much have arm's length trading relations. Compare them, for example, with trading agreements under the British Empire, when Australia was part of the British Empire, where it was London who determined what the agreement would be. Consider likewise the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was the propaganda name for the Japanese Empire from 1937 through to 1945, Japanese Empire in East Asia. And what about a trade agreement between US and Guatemala? It's a bit like Australia in the British Empire. The idea of trade relations is changing quite dramatically. Once upon a time, trade relations referred to the exchange of goods at the border. But in the modern period, with global supply chains, the nature of the transactions at the border are very different. The idea of a global supply chain is a reference to the ways in which goods and services move within transnational corporations but across borders. So a large amount of trade in goods and the provision of services across borders are actually within corporations or between associated entities controlled by transnational corporations. A further change in the way in which trade relations operate has been the growth in transnational investment in local production. So, for example, for the food industry, does much less by way of transporting goods across borders than transporting dollars into new countries, setting up their standard method of procurement and supply and production, and then profiting in that way. And then the further development in the concept of trade in more recent period is the idea of trade in services. And this has been largely driven by the financial sector, the consulting sector, the legal sector. That's to say, transnational banks, transnational consulting organisations, transnational legal firms who are interested in providing services across borders. What is happening with this is that trade agreements are progressively morphing into rules for economic integration. And the question then has to go back to my earlier slide about the power relations between the countries which are integrating. So we're moving from tariffs and quotas with respect to the trade in material goods and rules for sanitary and phytosanitary security, that's to say, rules about trade which might carry health risks, to moving towards common rules on intellectual property, on pharmaceutical pricing, on the conditions of investment, on financial regulation, competition policy, public procurement, standards of safety and quality, consumer protection, and customs procedures. The economic integration needs to be evaluated very much in terms of this slide about the power relations between the parties participating. And we'll return to that shortly. We now turn our attention to how trade relations affect health. And on this slide, I've listed 7 ways in which trade relations affect health. And in the next few slides, I'm going to be talking about each of these briefly. First of all, economic growth. I need to start by pointing out that what GDP, economic growth, is measured as GDP and what GDP represents. It's the sum of formal monetary transactions. So it excludes unwaged work, it excludes voluntary and community activities, it includes activities regardless of them being good or bad. It does not value environmental services. So the environment as a facility for processing waste is not the cost of that service that the environment provides is not considered, and it says nothing about the distribution of costs of gains and losses. So the notion that increasing GDP is necessarily good for population health is not such a reliable idea. We need to ask, what kind of economic growth? So economic growth which would be positive for health might involve more jobs, increased household income, increased opportunities for health. It might include improved tax revenue, improved public services and social security. It might be characterised by environmental sustainability. And we would hope that the benefits of growth and jobs and tax might be widely distributed. Patterns of economic growth which are not so good for health include jobless growth, with a large number of people in insecure or unemployed or in insecure employment, low-paid, insecure, part-time employment. It includes growth which does not fund public services or social security. It includes growth which is achieved at the cost of environmental degradation. And it includes growth where the benefits are inequitably distributed. So economic growth is one channel whereby trade relations may affect health, for good or bad. The second area is affordable access to medicines. The TRIPS agreement was signed in 1994 and came into operation in 1995. It provided 20-year patents over process and both over the product itself and the process for making that product. But it also included provision for countries to legislate for compulsory licensing. In other words, the government authorises the production by a generic company of a protected pharmaceutical product, and parallel importing. These are referred to as the TRIPS flexibilities. The rich countries didn't get everything they wanted, and certainly the pharmaceutical companies didn't get everything they wanted with the TRIPS agreement, and they kept pushing. And the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the US and Mexico, includes provisions which are generally referred to as TRIPS Plus. In other words, they're an extension of TRIPS, and they include an extended patent life, including periods of data exclusivity when generic manufacturers cannot use the data which have been already considered by the marketing authority. It includes restrictions on the use of compulsory licensing. It extends the possibility of patents to medical procedures, and it includes sanctions against the use of cost-effectiveness criteria in pharmaceutical reimbursement schemes. These are the kinds of provisions which are being progressively argued into agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the trade TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between Europe and the US. And you can see that the combination of TRIPS and the TRIPS Plus provisions all support the capacity of pharmaceutical manufacturers to charge higher prices for longer periods. The patent system is defended on the grounds that it is necessary to fund research and development, but there's a number of problems with this argument. First of all, it means that the drug companies will invest in accordance with their anticipated profits. So drugs for lifestyle diseases in the north, in the rich countries, are much more likely to get invented than drugs for neglected diseases of the global south. It's also the case that the pharmaceutical companies invest hugely out of their patents, out of the revenue achieved because of their monopolies. They invest hugely in marketing, which has the effect of oversupply, overprescribing, over consumption of pharmaceuticals, and the unnecessary expenditure where pharmaceutical reimbursement is supported by the public purse. So there are a range of other mechanisms through which research and development for pharmaceuticals could be supported. This means that the protection, that intellectual property protection, has a big impact on prices, but it's uneven. So if you look at this slide, it shows compares the prices in Jordan, where there is no generic competition, because because subject to agreements, the data exclusivity has been forced, compared to the price of the lowest priced equivalent in Egypt. This is a slide from Oxfam of 2007. And what you can see is that the prices in Jordan are way above the prices in Egypt by 800%, 360%, 167%, 500%, 550%, because in Jordan it's very, very hard to get generics into the market. In Egypt it's easier. So another slide demonstrating roughly the same thing is the price of AIDS medicines, depending upon whether national patent laws facilitate the entry of generics. So Efavirenz in Guatemala costs only $237 per patient year, whereas in El Salvador it costs $665. Lopinavir, ritonavir combination costs $1,000 in Benin, $500 in Burundi. Lamivudine and zidifudine in Congo costs $99 compared to Cameroon $200. So these prices are because of the trade agreements through which some countries have restricted their ability to use the TRIPS flexibilities, or alternatively have been bullied against using TRIPS flexibilities to ensure the cheapest price of drugs for their patients. Okay, so in other words, the second area where trade relations affect health is in relation to price of medicines. The third area I want to talk about is public health regulation. And this is one that we can look at in terms of opium and the opium wars, where the Chinese were not able to regulate the public health circumstances, and opium was forced on the Chinese population to their detriment. And the modern equivalent, which is tobacco and the role of plain packaging in controlling tobacco. The World Trade Organization accepts public health regulation is necessary, but requires that regulatory strategies are the least trade restrictive necessary, and the dispute panels determine least trade restrictive on the basis of agreed international standards, either under the SPS agreement, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, or the NTB agreement, the non-tariff barriers to trade. The WTO has no investor protection provisions, although the rich countries desperately wanted to include these in the original WTO. And dispute settlement is entirely on the state-to-state basis, not on investor-to-state dispute settlement. The free trade agreements, on the other hand, increasingly are including investor protection and investor state dispute settlement, or sometimes ISDS, which is being used at the moment in relation to tobacco plain packaging to attack the Australian tobacco plain packaging policies. That Philip Morris Asia is suing the Australians under a Australia-Hong Kong investment treaty, saying that plain packaging diminishes the value of their investment and therefore constitutes expropriation. Another quite complex case is the Chevron case, where the use of investor-state dispute settlement is being used to protect Chevron from having to clean up the mess it's made in Ecuador. On this slide, I've got the plain packaging issue. Australia's plain packaging laws have been subject to attack under Australian trademark law. Now that's been heard in the High Court and has been rejected. Philip Morris claimed that the Australian government had expropriated its trademark, whereas the Australians claimed successfully in the High Court that what they'd done is not to expropriate their trademark, but to restrict restrict the use of the trademark. A trademark simply gives you the protection from other people using it. It doesn't mean that you have an automatic right to use it. The second area where plain packaging is being attacked is in the TRIPS, under the TRIPS agreement, and a number of countries are challenging Australia under the WTO, under the TRIPS agreement, and the third area is under the Hong Kong bilateral investment treaty. These slides are taken from the Chevron case, and I urge you to have a look at the links which I've listed. This is a case where Chevron poured rubbish into the upper reaches of the Amazon in Ecuador, and when a judgment against Chevron was made in the High Court of Ecuador, telling them they had to clean it up, they took that to a investor state dispute settlement tribunal on the grounds that the High Court, the Supreme Court of Ecuador, was expropriating its was expropriating the value of its investment by forcing it to clean up its mess. Okay, so my fourth area of where trade relations affect health is in relation to decent jobs, and it's the way in which trade relations can affect labour standards and environmental standards, or more particularly where where the labour standards and environmental standards are lacking, combined with the race to the bottom, which is the pressure of international competitiveness on employment conditions and environmental standards. And the example I want to give is shipbreaking. These two photographs are taken from the Indian shipbreaking industry, which is extremely dangerous. People die on a weekly basis. But the pressures of international competitiveness means that India is willing to take these very, very dangerous industries, because otherwise, if they imposed labour standards or environmental standards, the industries would go somewhere else. So, decent jobs. This is a graph of fatality rates per 100,000 workers taken from the World Bank regions, differences in fatal occupational injuries. And what you can see is that Asia has a much, much higher rate of fatal rates per 100,000 workers, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, followed by the Middle East, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean. Surprisingly, China is quite low. India is slightly higher, and the former socialist economies are slightly higher. But the established market economies, which have long histories of and traditions of occupation of union struggle for occupational health safety, have much lower fatal rates. My fifth example of areas where, or it's not an example, my fifth area where areas of trade relations affect health is called livable environments. And the point I'm really wanting to emphasise under this heading is the way in which the race to the bottom, the pressure of international competitiveness, drives a race to the bottom with respect to environmental standards. And the example I'm giving is the transshipment of hazardous waste. Although the story that I want to tell here is actually slightly more positive, because it demonstrates the way a trade agreement, in this case an agreement to restrict the transshipment of hazardous waste, has in fact improved living standards, livable environments. These data are taken from a number of sources from the late 1980s, during which time something between 300 and 500 million tonnes of hazardous waste materials were generated internationally, and between 10 to 15% of this was shipped across international boundaries. Most of the waste was produced in the OECD countries, particularly in the United States. Much of the traded hazardous waste was traded amongst industrialised countries, but around 5 million tonnes of hazardous waste was exported each year to Eastern Europe and to developing countries, and around 2.5 million tonnes from the OECD to non-OECD countries between 89 and 94. Of course, the logic of this is clear when you look at the disposal costs. In the late 1980s varied from $2.50 to $50 per tonne in Africa, compared to $100 to $200 per tonne in the industrialised countries. However, in 1989, the Basel Convention was adopted, which regulates the transshipment of waste through a mechanism known as prior informed consent, which means that if you're going to dump waste in somebody else's country, you have to get prior informed consent from the government of that country. An amendment to the Basel Convention, which was adopted or drafted in 1995, would simply ban the export of hazardous waste from OECD countries to developing countries. However, this is still not in force because Australia and Canada and the US have refused to ratify it. So that's my example of the way in which livable environments are shaped by trade relations. Very similar in my next group is actually fairly similar. It's about social infrastructure and the way in which trade relations shape housing, sanitation and water supply. And the main point I'm wanting to make here, well, I'm making 2 points. The first point I'm making here is the way fiscal capacity determines investment in social structure. And so the tax revenues which are available to low and middle income countries to invest in social infrastructure are a function of the trading relations, fair trade or unfair trade, and tax justice. And again, tax justice is something which could be subject to much more effective international regulation. The second point I'm making on this slide is the way in which the Agreement on Agriculture, the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, enables subsidised global agribusiness to dump subsidised foodstuffs on in the big cities of the low and middle income countries, and thereby undercutting small farmers' ability to sell into those markets. So undermining small farmers' livelihoods leads to urbanisation, leads to unhygienic settlements, poor housing, poor sanitation, unclean water, as a consequence of both of these two influences operating. Just as an example of the second of these two dot points, we might look at jobs in cotton production which are at risk in Southern Africa because of the dumping of subsidised US cotton on global markets. These data come from Zimbabwe. Researchers in Zimbabwe who've calculated the number of jobs which are at risk in Malawi, Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia and Zimbabwe as a consequence of further liberalisation of imports, which is being demanded by the EU as a condition for export access to European markets. So the US is dumping subsidised cotton on global markets. The EU is saying to the African countries that if they want to export cotton into the EU, they have to further liberalise their imports. And the argument is that jobs are at risk, that further urban migration will be the consequence, and further urban slums. My seventh area that I'm drawing attention to under this heading of the ways in which trade affects health is nutrition. Food security, food sovereignty and nutrition. And on this slide I've pointed out that broadly speaking, I've identified two broad areas where trade agreements shape diet and food security. One is where cheap, high density, low nutrient manufactured goods, foods are being sold, are being exported, or are being manufactured domestically by transnational corporations. The particular case in Asia, in the Pacific Islands, of course, is mutton flaps and turkey tails, which are being exported respectively from New Zealand and from the US at very low prices because nobody in those countries will eat them, and being sold, contributing to a high density, low nutrient diet in the Pacific Island countries. A second factor which is linked to trading and global regulation is the way in which global speculation in food prices has from time to time led to food price spikes and hunger as a consequence. This slide is broadly about the problems of obesity in the Pacific Island countries, and it's taken from work done through WHO, UNDP on NCD risk factors, and demonstrates the proportion of the population, both men and women, who are obese and therefore probably at much greater risk of dying, partly as a consequence of the rubbish food which is being sold. This graph is a graph about food price volatility, for which in particular focusing on the period 2007-2008. These were at a time when the food supply was fine, but the speculators were hoarding, were buying up futures and hoarding them in order to make a killing on the food supply market. This story is elaborated in more detail in the reference given Global Health Watch 3, 2011, page 171. Okay, so there's 7 ways, I'll just go back to the original slide, 7 ways in which trade relations affect health: economic growth, access to medicines, public health regulation, decent jobs, livable environments, social infrastructure, food security and nutrition. Now let's talk a little bit about food about trade policies. On this slide, I've listed 4 different different kinds of trade policy, 4 areas of trade policy which different countries might be promoting. First of all is simply liberalisation in the trade in goods, and this is as old as the hills, that powerful countries with strong domestic industry seek to prevent other countries from seek to force other countries to buy their goods, and therefore reduce tariffs, not to use quotas and not to use subsidies to support the local production of similar goods. Following the earlier comments I made about the difference between trade in goods and economic integration, the second batch of trade policies are trade policies which are not so much about trade in the arm's length trade in goods as about economic integration. Common rules on the trade in services, on investment, investor protection, on intellectual property, financial regulation, competition policy, etc. In some respects, running counter to the idea of economic integration are trade policies which are directed at protectionism and self-sufficiency. And this can be possibly, it can be the result of powerful interests within countries forcing governments to protect them using political pressures, but it can also be active strategic decision making by governments to develop local industry, local production, local supply, either within individual countries or on a regional basis. The fourth pattern with respect to trade policy, which I've listed here, is policies which are directed at promoting economic development for low and middle income countries. And the three elements of such policies that I'm highlighting here is, first of all, the non-reciprocal nature of such policies. That if rich countries are engaging in trade agreements with poor countries, the development objective requires that those agreements be non-reciprocal. In other words, you don't require the poorer country to make concessions which are comparable in value to the concessions you expect from the richer countries. This is also referred to as special and differential treatment. Special and differential treatment is talked about a lot, but has been quite marginal in terms of, certainly in terms of the free trade agreements. The second point I'm making under development, trade for development, is the concept of aid for trade, to provide support to countries, development assistance to smooth out their trading capacity. That might be about building ports or airports or supporting the development of their customs arrangements. And thirdly is the issue of providing support for climate change adaptation, mitigation, etc., as a means to contribute to economic and social development. So there's a set of trade policies, but let's look at the process of trade negotiation. Trade agreements essentially are rules governing trade and perhaps economic integration between countries. They are as binding, or the degree to which they are binding depends upon the quality of the text in terms of how tight the text is, but also on dispute settlement provisions and the sanctions which are associated with failure to comply. The trade agreements differ hugely from, let's say, human rights agreements between countries, because trade agreements have usually have very effective sanctions insofar as they legitimize countries imposing trade sanctions on other countries. However, it needs to be emphasized that the sanctions depend upon the relative size of the two countries. So if Guatemala brings a case against the US, the sanctions which Guatemala is able to impose on the US in terms of reciprocal withdrawal of trade privileges are hugely different from the sanctions which the US is able to impose on Guatemala. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the different types of agreements, which include, as on this slide, multilateral, which means agreements among everyone, and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, or the GATT agreement, which was finalized in 1948 and still operates, illustrates this, as does all the other WTO agreements. No, not all the other WTO agreements, many of them, because there are also plurilateral agreements. That means agreements with a smaller number of consenting parties, which may be regional or may be preferential, but not regional. And these include NAFTA, which is clearly a regional preferential trade agreement, but also a plurilateral agreement. The proposed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and a range of ASEAN agreements. And then, of course, you can have bilateral agreements, as in the AUSFTA, or Australian-US Free Trade Agreement, or the KORUS, which is the Korean-US Free Trade Agreement, and so forth. These agreements, as I've said before, start with the trade in goods. They may then extend to so-called trade in services, but they generally also include agreement on various regulatory frameworks, which may include investment, the provision of services, intellectual property, data flow, government procurement, SPS and TBT. SPS stands for sanitary and phytosanitary standards. That, in other words, in the health and in the food area, this would be the Codex Alimentarius. So the standards which are required for food imports are governed by the SPS agreement, but the standards are determined by the Codex. And then TBT, which stands for technical barriers to trade. And this might include, for example, food labelling requirements. There's a range of legal principles and negotiating principles which emerge in this very technical field. And I've just listed 3 of them on this slide. One is MFN, or Most Favoured Nation. And this basically means that if you give certain trading privileges to another member of the trading agreement, another signatory to this particular trading agreement, then you're obligated to give the same privileges to all the other members of this agreement. So that's MFN, Most Favoured Nation. National treatment means that if a government treats domestic corporations with a particular level of preference, they must give that preference to the corporations of participating countries. And single undertaking means that these agreements continue to be negotiated until every bit has been agreed, and as they say, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Okay. Now, then there are certain things called implementation provisions, and I've listed 3 here. One is dispute settlement, and we'll come to that in a minute. One is the commitment to renegotiation, and the third is the provisions for a secretariat. The processes of negotiating trade agreements need to be unpacked, need to be made more, people need to be aware of them. Firstly, the agreements are based on texts which will be circulated by one or other of the participating countries, and the texts typically will have bold text, which means that somebody has suggested the insertion of a new text, and they will have bracketed text, using square brackets to show that some members of the negotiation do not have not agreed to this particular provision. The negotiating process involves sessions where the negotiators will meet. In the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, these sessions rotate around the participating countries. The stakeholders will be very interested in what's going on. These might be corporate stakeholders, they may be civil society, public interest, civil society groups as stakeholders. Interestingly, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the US has provision for around 500 of the large corporations to sit on advisory committees which have access to the text, but none of the other stakeholders, certainly none of the corporate stakeholders or civil society stakeholders in other countries have access to the TPP text. The interest group lobbying is furious, and it's useful to identify the difference between the lobbying of local affiliates of overseas corporations. So, for example, in the Australian situation, the Ford Motor Company is an active lobbyist regarding the Australian position in the TPP negotiations, but of course it's lobbying in accordance with the interests of its parent company, Ford, in the US, as distinct from Australian corporations who may be lobbying in their own interest, of course, but their interests may rebound more positively on Australia. Not always. Increasingly, these negotiations are held in secret. The original negotiations of the WTO were not nearly as secretive, but the more recent negotiations of the TPP, the TTIP, we'll come to these various acronyms in due course, and the teaser and so forth are hugely secret. The goal of the exercise clearly is to get the negotiations finished before anyone finds out about them. It is the very antithesis of democratic consultative process. There's a lot of bullying goes on in these negotiations. Countries which are able to bring many high-level experts will resort to all sorts of obfuscation and bullying in relation to smaller countries in order to achieve the quotes national interest. Notionally, the policy, the negotiations are determined by trade policy, but as we'll see, it's very hard to predict the outcomes of particular trading agreements. And finally, these agreements are highly legalistic. Okay, so there's two broad drivers of the negotiations which need to be thought about. One is the public interest, and one is vested interests. And in particular, I'm thinking, for example, of agricultural interests, like the New Zealand dairy interest is very keen to get access to the US market. The Vietnamese clothing industry is very keen to get access to the US market. The US market is the nirvana because it is by far the biggest consumer market, so it's very important for exporters. As I've said, we need to make a distinction between the vested interests of local affiliates of overseas foreign-owned corporations and the vested interests of local corporations and local industry sectors. The recognition of vested interests as driving the negotiation of these agreements links to the difficulties of assessing the impact. You can imagine an econometrician seeking to estimate the net national benefit of a new trade agreement, which will mean starting with some kind of model of the existing economy in the context of the global economy with particular levels of exports and imports, and then making estimates about the likely implications of this new provision, that new provision, this drop in tariff, that increase in this deregulation, and so forth. And this kind of formal, comprehensive impact assessment is extremely hard, extremely unreliable, and probably impossible. It's much easier to estimate the benefits to specific interest groups. If the sugar industry of North Queensland gets access to the US market, this will mean increased sales, increased economic activity in North Queensland, and an identifiable contribution to the Australian GDP. If the dairy industry in New Zealand gets access to the US market, likewise, they will. We can estimate, but the concessions which Australia might make, let's say in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, the concessions Australia might make in order to get access to the US sugar market may be much harder to assess in terms of, for example, agreeing to accept investor-state dispute settlement is a much more uncertain provision to estimate the outcomes of, and it's one where there are wildly different predictions. So impact assessment often is driven by general principles like trade is good, free trade is better. Whether these are general principles or simply ideology is in some cases a matter of debate. Okay, so let's now look at the WTO itself. There was a very important conference towards the end of the Second World War held in Bretton Woods, a town in New Hampshire in the US, where the decision was taken to establish the World Bank and to establish the International Monetary Fund, but a decision, although they discussed the possibility of setting up an international trade organization, it was decided not to proceed with that at that time. Instead of an international trade organization, the Bretton Woods process led to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which operated from 1946, operated as the main international multilateral set of rules for trade from 1946 to 1995. It still operates under the aegis of the World Trade Organization. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, dealt only with the trade in goods. It did not deal with services, and with some exceptions, largely didn't deal with economic integration. The life history of the GATT was one of progressive renegotiation of international agreements on tariffs, and slow progress was made towards trade liberalisation. The Uruguay round was commenced in 1986. That's a round of negotiations for reworking the GATT, but actually for establishing a new World Trade Organization. The Uruguay round of negotiations took place between the 1986 and 1994, finalized with the Treaty of Marrakesh in 1994, when all the agreements were finalized and the WTO was established. It's a little glimpse of how these things happen is that it might be gained from reflecting on the emergence of the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, under the Uruguay round. Prior to 1986, intellectual property was largely managed through WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. And the manufacturers, including in particular the pharmaceutical manufacturers, had for quite some time been trying to use WIPO in order to negotiate tighter intellectual property provisions, which actually includes easier patenting and more rigorous enforcement of such provisions. But between the 1970s and 1980s, there was what's commonly called a forum shift from the WIPO into the Uruguay round, and the energy which Big Pharma had been putting into new intellectual property provisions in WIPO was turned into the Uruguay process in order to create the TRIPS agreement. Okay, so what is the WTO? Well, it's the Secretariat which administers the agreements. It was established in 1995. It's based in Geneva. It has 160 member countries, and the organizational structure includes the Director General, the Secretariat, the Ministerial Conference, which is the supreme governing body of the World Trade Organization, which meets every 2 years, usually in Singapore, Hong Kong, Doha, Cancun, etc., 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 Geneva. Underneath the Ministerial Conference is the General Council, which administers the organization, or has the authority over the organization between meetings of the Ministerial Conference. And then there are specific councils which have responsibility for overseeing the implementation of the various agreements. There is a specific council for each agreement. Critical as well to the work of the WTO is the dispute settlement body, which I'll come to in a moment. The ministerial council meetings are the big punctuation marks in the history of the WTO, from Marrakesh, where the agreement to establish the WTO was signed, to the first ministerial council meeting in Singapore, which gave rise to what are sometimes called the Singapore issues, which did not, in fact, get into the WTO. These include government procurement, trade facilitation, investment, and competition policy. And the various attempts to incorporate these four issues into WTO agreements have been stalled largely by the developing countries. They generally are pushed by the OECD countries, but they have also been pushed in the free trade domain. So at the moment there is a discussion about a trade facilitation agreement. There are investment provisions and investment treaties being negotiated all over the place, and competition policy and government procurement are now standard components of the plurilateral agreements such as the TPP and the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the US and Europe. So getting on with these ministerial council meetings, we have Geneva in 1998 and Seattle in 1999. Seattle was a site of huge street battles. There were many different constituencies and very little was achieved. The negotiation process in Seattle was one of outright bullying, but nonetheless the attempts to get these Singapore issues onto the agenda were not successful. The highlight of the Doha Ministerial Conference in November 2001 was the Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health, which affirmed the legitimacy of using the TRIPS agreement in a flexible way to enable things like compulsory licensing and parallel importing. And the other thing about the Doha Agreement was that it launched what was called a development round. In other words, the next round of negotiations will be focused on the requirements to support economic development in the third world. This, of course, has completely stalled. At Cancun, the big focus was on the deadlock between the claims of the OECD rich countries, who are asking for continued tariff reductions by the developing countries, particularly the emerging economies, tariff reductions so that the exports of the rich countries can have easier access at cheaper prices to the markets of the developing countries. And you see references quite frequently to the 200 million rich people in China and the 200 million middle class or 500 million middle class in India and so forth. And this is the market that those corporations are looking for. But the developing countries resisted that press in Cancun in Mexico, arguing that until they had access to the agricultural markets of the rich world, they were not willing to give further concessions in terms of what's called market access. That's market access meaning access to developing country markets for goods. The agricultural protection of the rich countries varies somewhat between Japan and Europe, which are largely protectionist, with subsidies, but not a huge degree of exporting subsidized product, compared to the US, which has high tariff protection, but also has subsidies which contribute greatly to the dumping of subsidized product on export markets in agriculture. The focus at the 2005 Hong Kong Ministerial Council was the renegotiation of the GATS agreement, the General Agreement on the Trade in Services. And this process of renegotiating the GATS agreement was hoping to extend the number of sectors of services which would be opened through a renegotiated GATS agreement. This process was not successful. Again, it was stalled because not enough countries made offers of opening up their markets, their service markets, to liberalisation, which led to what is now called the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, which I'll come back to in a short while. TISA has not been finalised; it is still being discussed, but it is a free trade agreement among consenting partners, which they then hope would be imposed on others. So with subsequent meetings in Geneva, the WTO is in a sense in mothballs, while the focus of action has moved to the free trade agreements. But nonetheless, the agreements which have been negotiated continue to operate. The WTO administers a huge number of agreements. There's 13 agreements which deal with the trade in goods. Then there's the General Agreement on Trade in Services, or GATS. We've talked about the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. There's the Understanding on Rules and Procedures Governing the Settlement of Disputes, which is referred to as the Dispute Settlement Understanding. There's a Trade Policy Review Mechanism, and there's a series of non-mandatory agreements. Well, they're mandatory if you enter into them, but it's not mandatory to do so. On this slide, we've listed some of the agreements governing trade in goods, starting with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which was the original agreement from 1948, to the Agreement on Agriculture, which was deliberately not included in 1948. The Agreement on Agriculture I'll come to shortly, but it's quite contorted with a range of boxes, green, blue and red, which make it legitimate for protectionism and subsidies to continue to operate in Europe, Japan and the US, and which have the effect of shutting out imports from many developing countries, a big issue. The sanitary and phytosanitary measures are of interest and relevance to health people, SPS agreement. And as I said, this is about the legitimacy, this governs the use of food safety or bacteriological safety or safety with regard to plants or animals as well as humans as barriers to trade. There's a textile and clothing agreement, the technical barriers to trade agreement, etc., etc. Rules of origin refers to the degree to which you can say that a product has originated in your country if, in fact, the inputs to that product came from other countries. These are very technical things, and one could follow them up at a later time. Disputes are at the heart of the WTO system because out of disputes come the sanctions, which mean that these rules, broadly speaking, have to be obeyed once you've agreed to them. Member states can bring complaints before the dispute settlement body to the effect that one or more of their trading partners is violating some of the WTO agreements. It's useful to note that there's around 24,000 pages of agreement, which means that to engage in these processes, you really need to have a large stable of trade lawyers to make sense of the 24,000 pages. The dispute settlement body will refer after an initial consultation period, will refer the dispute to a specially constituted panel, which will make a recommendation which may go to the appellate body and may come back to the dispute settlement body and may determine that there is no justice to the complaint, or may sanction particular penalties. Now, the penalties may be the payment of compensation to the government which has been badly treated, or to the company, or may include retaliatory trade restrictions on exports from the offending nation. Let's discuss two such complaints. No. Let's do the principles first. The principles of dispute resolution, and these sound simple, but they are hugely legalistic, include, first of all, least trade restrictive regulation. In other words, if there are options for regulating for a particular public purpose, the least trade restrictive would be the one that's obligated. So the tobacco manufacturers claim that plain packaging is not the least trade restrictive, that the Australian government and other governments concerned about tobacco smoking should simply advise smokers not to do so, and that would be the least trade restrictive regulation. The regulatory strategies should be voluntary wherever possible rather than compulsory, so voluntary strategies should have been exhausted. Consumer information is preferred to regulatory bans, and individual rather than public responsibility are to be assumed. So these clearly point in a particular direction towards free trade and away from effective public health regulation. And it's to be remembered that these dispute resolution principles will be interpreted by trade lawyers, certainly not by public health practitioners. Okay, so let's start with the asbestos case, which was which commenced in 1997 with a ban on the manufacturing, processing and sale of asbestos within France. Canada complained to the WTO that the ban was illegal because it damaged Canadian economic interests and was a barrier to free trade. The WTO ruled that the ban was indeed a barrier to free trade, but that it was legal on health grounds. We can contrast the asbestos case with the hormones in beef case. In 1996, the US complained to the WTO regarding a European Community ban on hormones in beef, ban on the import of beef from the US, which had been treated with hormones. The US was joined by Canada a little bit later. A panel was established and reported in August 1996 that the ban was not consistent with the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, basically because it was not supported by science, and that the necessary scientific studies to justify such a ban had not been undertaken. And those which had been undertaken did not support such a ban. The European community, the reality of this situation was that the ban was a response to very strong public and consumer pressure wanting to ban hormone-treated beef, treating beef with hormones as a growth promoter. And in fact, this was supported by the European Parliament, and the European Commission was simply responding to very strong consumer pressure. However, it was inconsistent with the SPS agreement. The Europeans appealed to the appellate body. It rejected the appeal in January 1998. The European Commission indicated that it would pay compensation. It would rather pay compensation rather than repeal the ban, and the US was authorized to impose a penalty of around $117 million per annum on imports from Europe into the US. In other words, what was said was that they were suspending certain concessions to the value of $117 million per year. 10 years later, there was a lot of negotiation, and finally an MOU was achieved between the US and the EU, which essentially provides for the import into Europe of beef from the US, which is certified as not having been treated with hormones, but it is still subject to discussion. Okay, so what are the main WTO agreements which affect health? Well, I'm going to talk briefly about 5 of them. And in my view, the Agreement on Agriculture is the agreement which is of most relevance to health. The Agreement on Agriculture is not focused on health, but because of the impact of agricultural barriers, both tariffs and quotas, for developing countries to access the rich country markets, particularly Europe, Japan, and the US, and the subsidies which rich country governments are paying to their producers, in particular the corporate agribusiness involved, and the dumping by rich countries of cheap agricultural product on poor country markets, the damage this does to poor farmers is of such degree that it is of great significance to public health, or should be. Now, let me just, for people who are not sure what this word dumping means, let me clarify. Dumping means that you export product which has been subsidized, so you're effectively exporting product at lower than the price of production. That's what dumping is. And the consequence of that is that farm subsidies in the US are of the order of $2.70 per cow per day. In Japan, it's the order of $8 per cow per day, which compares sharply with India, where 600 farmers are living on less than $1 per day, and in the US, where 25,000 cotton farmers are receiving in total around $10 million per day. So the values, the standards which are reflected in these farm subsidies are grotesque. In Europe, 80% of food subsidies go to agribusiness, including the Tate and Lyle, who deal in sugar, who got $404 million in 2003-4. Arla Foods in Denmark, $205 million, and Nestle in the UK, $20 million. I'm grateful to David Sanders for this slide, but the picture it paints is quite distressing. Okay, so let's trace the way in which this works. Let's start at the top left-hand corner, where rich world protection, domestic support, and export subsidy contribute to oversupply, and therefore a push to export the oversupply, which contributes to low prices for developing country farmers. And we can follow low prices to developing country farmers either to loss of agricultural income at the top right, or to the left middle, to cheap food in cities. Now they're 2 separate trains. Let's stay with the loss of agricultural income at the top. Leads to rural poverty, leads to rural urban migration, leads to a reserve army of unemployed in the cities, which enables low wages, and now let's go across to the left-hand side, where we can see the low prices for developing country farmers lead to cheap food in the cities, which, associated with this reserve army of the unemployed and low wages, leads to the growth of unskilled labour-intensive export processing, which provides jobs in the cities of a sort, but also leads to the rise of an urban middle class who undertake the business side, and skilled staff who then leads to the widening of income inequalities. So the rural poverty leads to the health effects of poverty associated with the rural-urban migration and low wages. But the middle class, which grows out of this export processing, is associated with the widening income inequality. And widening income inequality leads to weakening of social solidarity with public expenditure, and with that comes a reluctance to expend on income security for poor people, unemployment benefits, pensions, and so forth, which contributes further to the health effects of poverty and of displacement, and weakens the public willingness to support the infrastructure needed in the urban settlements. So whilst a lot of these effects are not only due to rich world dumping and protection, rich world dumping and protection undoubtedly contributes to this picture. Okay, so that's the Agreement on Agriculture. I want to turn now to the TRIPS agreement, the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property, which has a huge impact on the price of medicines. That's indeed the main way in which the TRIPS agreement affects health. The TRIPS agreement provides for agreed standards for intellectual property rights and for uniform protection of various intellectual property rights, which include patents, trademarks, designs, and trade secrets. The TRIPS agreement includes the principles of national treatment and most favoured nation treatment. You remember, most favoured nation means that if you make concessions for one member of the agreement, you must make the same concessions for all. And national treatment means that if you treat domestic corporations with particular favours, you must extend those favours to foreign corporations as well. The advent of the TRIPS agreement was also introduced the principle of 20-year patents. In many countries had less than that, 16 or 12-year patents prior to that, and required the patenting of required legislation for the patenting of both the product and the process for developing it. And this is of quite important significance in the story we're going to be telling, because the Indian patent regime prior to India, prior to the TRIPS agreement taking effect in India in 2005, the Indian patent regime allowed for the patenting of process but not product, which meant that if you could develop an alternative pathway for generating the same product, you were able to market it without paying royalties to the owner of the patent. The TRIPS agreement is an agreement between nations which sets out certain standards, but those standards have to be written into domestic legislation. And so there are different ways in which the standards of the TRIPS agreement can be written into domestic legislation. TRIPS allows for compulsory licensing and allows for parallel importing, but many countries, often under pressure from the big pharmaceutical manufacturing countries, have elected to adopt patent legislation which does not leave space for compulsory licensing and parallel importation. This is a big slogan among the developing countries, and the slogan is structured around this term TRIPS flexibilities. And the point of the slogan is to advise countries to, when they develop their patent legislation, to ensure that they leave space for compulsory licensing and parallel importing and other aspects of the flexibilities built into the TRIPS agreement. There's been a series of famous cases around the issue of access to pharmaceuticals, which we really don't have time to go into in any detail, but I'll skip past them briefly. Brazil has repeatedly used the threat of compulsory licensing of generic equivalents of antiretrovirals in order to force the companies to provide lower prices. So the benefit of having the capacity for issuing compulsory licensing, and perhaps I should reiterate the meaning of this term compulsory licensing. It means that the government gives a license to a generic manufacturer to produce a pharmaceutical product which is still covered by a patent, and presumably to pay an appropriate royalty to the owner of the patent. But the generic manufacturer does not have to get the approval of the patent owner to do the production. Brazil has achieved a magnificent outcomes in terms of its HIV care. Free care for people with HIV. AIDS-related deaths have been halved in 4 years. The spread of HIV had been reduced. And savings of around $500 million are estimated because of the encouragement of generic equivalents of patented drugs, saving around $400 million in hospitalisation costs per year. Brazil has been taken to a WTO dispute panel by the US over its patent legislation, but not over the explicit issuing of compulsory licensing. I've made several references to the South African treatment action campaign and treatment action issues in South Africa, and on this slide we've dealt with this in some detail. In 1997, South Africa passed a new law for the procurement of medicines, including sourcing brand name drugs internationally through the cheapest supplier, so-called parallel importation. In 1998, 39 drug manufacturers, mainly international corporations, sued the South African government, arguing that the law contravened the TRIPS agreement. From 97 to 99, there was continuing pressure from the US government on the South African government. But during 1999, ACT UP, the AIDS activist organization in the US, dogged the Al Gore campaign over access and intellectual property and over its pressure on South Africa. And from late 1999, the US government started to back off until it finally withdrew its support for the drug companies. In 2001, Médecins Sans Frontières collected around 250,000 signatures on a petition against the lawsuit. In 2001, the Treatment Action Campaign was granted Friend of Court status and put forward a powerful, very well-informed legal case. In April the 18th, Big Pharma sought an adjournment, confronted by the material from the Treatment Action Campaign. And on April the 19th, the companies withdrew their lawsuit and agreed to pay the government's legal costs. Now, this was partly because of the withdrawal of US government support, but partly because of the power of the people in the streets and the degree to which Big Pharma was losing legitimacy. The April 2001, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland convened a meeting of WHO and the World Bank and the big pharma companies in Norway to discuss treatment access. And that meeting came up with a recommendation for differential pricing, sometimes called tiered pricing, which means that the drug companies undertake to sell drugs at different prices in different markets. However, in late 2001, the WTO meeting at Doha reaffirmed the legitimacy of compulsory licensing as provided for in the TRIPS agreement. The outcome of the South African Treatment Action Campaign was very influenced by the fact that the Indian generic manufacturers, still working under process-only patents, a patenting legal regime which only legitimised process patents, was actually selling this generic manufacturer in India was selling to MSF the 3-drug cocktail at $350 per year, compared to $10,000 to $12,000 per year in the Western markets. Cipla was also offering to pay the patent owners a 5% commission. The Indian pharmaceutical company has been huge. It's sometimes referred to as the pharmacy of the developing world. It has a large generic sector and exports to many, many countries. Around half of the drugs used around the world to treat AIDS come from India. The Indian, as a lower middle income country, India did not have to abide by the rules of WTO until 10 years after it joined. So they joined in 1995, but it was the rules of the TRIPS agreement didn't come into play until 2005, and so India was required in 2005 to adopt a patent act which included the patenting of both the product and the patent. However, the law that the Indians adopted imposed quite strict requirements for the patent, including in particular that a new form as in section 3D, that a new form of a known substance doesn't deserve a patent. So the hurdle to actually get a patent granted under the new Patent Act in India was much tighter than has been the case in the US and the OECD countries. And this is worth quoting: the mere discovery of a new form of a known substance which doesn't result in the enhancement of the efficacy of that substance, or the mere discovery of any new property or a new use of a known substance, etc. These are not legitimated, unless such known process results in a new product or employs at least one new reactant. The Indian Patent Act has been challenged in particular by Novartis in relation to this drug imatinib, which is used for chronic myeloid leukemia. From 1992 to 1998, generic versions of imatinib were circulating in India, were manufactured in India, and were on sale for around 1/10 of the price of Novartis's version of imatinib, which is Gleevec. In 1998, Novartis applied for a patent for Gleevec. Because the patent law the new patent law hadn't come into effect, they were granted what was called an exclusive marketing rights, and the generic manufacturers had to withdraw their versions of the drug. In 2005, India's obligations under the WTO came into effect, and in January 2006, Novartis applied for a patent on the basis of it had changed slightly the imatinib which had been circulating by putting the mesylate salt, and but their requirement for a patent of their version of imatinib was rejected by the Patents Office in Chennai because of the structural similarity to an earlier version which had been circulating since 1993. So that was the Chennai Patent Office. Novartis filed a case with the High Court in the state, and against the decision of the Patent Office, and against the provision of Section 3D of the new Indian Patents Act, arguing that it was not in compliance with TRIPS. The appeal against the Patent Office decision was transferred to a new organisation, the Intellectual Property Appellate Board, which was a national body. But the Madras High Court determined that Section 3D was in fact legal. In July 2009, the Patent Appellate Board rejected Novartis's appeal against the Patent Office. They appealed again against the Appellate Board to the Supreme Court, and in 2013 the Supreme Court rejected their appeal. Now, the significance of this story is that that there was intense diplomatic and commercial pressure placed on India to back off its very high standard of patenting. The Novartis position is the standard position of the drug companies, that strong intellectual property rights give the companies incentive to innovate. Novartis claims that they have got an international patient assistance program that has provided free drugs to many, many patients, and that Novartis wanted to be able to take advantage of the emerging middle class in India. The critique of Novartis was that the patient assistance program, the charity program that they were running, was not sustainable, and that excuse me, there were many, many cases who were not getting access, cases of chronic myeloid leukemia who are not getting access to it, and that if Novartis was successful, more medicines would be patented, and that it would be very difficult for generic manufacturers to produce affordable generic versions of essential medicines. We now turn our attention to the General Agreement on Trade and Services, or GATS. This is a complicated agreement. It has certain provisions which apply to all kinds of services, and others which are open to individual countries to specify. So, for example, any service which is included in the GATS, covered by the GATS agreement for a particular country, has to abide by the most favoured nation principle. In other words, if you make this service, if you allow for the importation of this service, then for one country it must be for all countries who are signatories to the GATS agreement. And transparency, which is that there should be accessible databases of laws and regulations regarding services, which mean that all services which are available for importation, the regulatory information will be available. Then there are provisions which apply to the specified services under the GATS agreement. One is market access, in other words, that whether or not foreign producers of this service have access to the market. And the second is national treatment, whether or not particular services will be treated under the principle of national treatment, for example, subsidies. So in other words, national treatment would provide that if you're subsidizing a domestic provider, you will give a subsidy to any international provider. But this is open to the participating country to specify whether or not national treatment will apply to a particular service. The GATS agreement includes what's called the positive list approach, so that participants in the agreement have the option of actually specifying what services it will apply to, rather than assuming that it applies to all services, or all services except those which have been explicitly excluded. That would be a negative list approach. And finally, it has a ratchet function that, whilst it's very easy to apply GATS principles to new services, it's very hard to withdraw services which have been committed. And finally, the GATS agreement provides for a schedule for renegotiation and extension of the agreement. Now, what are services? On this slide, we've listed the 8 broad areas of service: trade and tourism, business, professional, technical, telecommunications, asset management, medical services, etc. But it's worth emphasizing that it is the big financial corporations, the big management consulting corporations, the big telecommunications corporations, who have been driving the development of the GATS agreement. In other words, the banks want to be able to operate in as many countries as possible, and it is the GATS agreement which was seen as the way in which they would get access. Just one more point then about the technology of the GATS agreement, which is the modes of supply. So if once you've agreed to a particular service, you also need to agree to the modes of supply. So cross-border supply would be illustrated in the health instance by telemedicine. Consumption abroad would be illustrated in the medical area by patients travelling abroad, the so-called medical tourism. Commercial presence, which is the third mode of supply, is when foreign-owned corporations come to operate in your jurisdiction. So this would mean health insurance companies or healthcare corporations. And the presence of natural persons is where doctors or nurses would migrate. So in other words, the service providers actually move into your country. It's really interesting to see what services in the health area the Australians have given away or have made provision for. So under the Section 8, health related and social services, we see that over at the top here that we've got the reference to the 4 modes of supply, and we've got reference to both market access and treatment. You remember I said that most favoured nation status applies to all services which are included, but you can specify whether market access and national treatment will apply, and then you specify whether they apply to the different modes of delivery. So unbound here refers to cross-border supply, is unbound with regard to the services which are provided. The consumption abroad is not provided for, and commercial presence is not provided for, but the presence of natural persons is unbound except as indicated in the horizontal section. So Australia has committed itself to allowing podiatry and chiropody services, which it states here includes podiatry services carried out in health clinics, residential healthcare facilities other than hospitals, as well as consulting rooms and patients' homes. This is a it's really quite fascinating that in all the areas of healthcare delivery, the only one which has been committed by Australia for under the GATS agreement is chiropody or podiatry. Just looking then at this column under national treatment, it is unbound for the presence of natural persons, except that permanent residency will be a requirement in South Australia and permanent residency is a requirement for podiatrists in Western Australia. I think the point I'm making is to emphasise that the rich countries have been fairly cautious about their GATS commitments, but they've put a lot of pressure on the poorer countries, many of whom have made GATS commitments for all of healthcare and all of health insurance. I should emphasise that this section, health related and social services, under the GATS agreement does not include health insurance, which is included under insurance, under finance, and that in the Australian case has been, there is a commitment to that. The GATS agreement was scheduled for renegotiation from 2005, but that renegotiation process ground to a halt, and it's as a consequence of that the forum for discussing trade and services shifted to TISA from 2013, the Trade and Services Agreement. This has not been finalised. Before going on to TISA, let me just mention this opt-in, opt-out principle. In GATS in 1994, the GATS agreement from 1994 includes the opt-in principle. In other words, it's called the positive list principle, that that you specify what services the GATS agreement shall apply to. The revision of the GATS agreement was initially scheduled for 2000, and this would involve what's called a request and offer process, that one country would make a request of another country to open up its service sector to that country, and an offer would then be made on that basis, but that offer then would apply on a most favoured nation basis to all participants. The revision stalled, apparently for lack of lack of offers, and an opt-out option was canvassed as a negative list. In other words, it would apply, the GATS would apply to all services unless you opted out, but that was not agreed to. So the forum shifted to TISA in 2013, and this has involved the countries which I've listed on this slide. The focus of TISA is clearly financial services and legal services, and while public health people worry about health systems and about health insurance, the bigger worry probably is the protection that TISA would provide to the banks and the financial service providers away from being effectively regulated. Okay. So TISA is where the action is at the moment, but we will move on to consider briefly SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which deal with regulatory standards governing human, plant and animal health, and that such standards should be based on international bodies such as the Codex Alimentarius. But as discussed earlier, the more restrictive regulation must be based on scientific risk assessment, and I talked earlier about the hormone-treated beef, which was judged to be not supported by science, and therefore the Europeans had to accept a sanction from the Americans. Technical barriers for trade seems to be particularly relevant to water supply, food production, maybe labelling of food and drugs. This basically encourages the use of internationally agreed standards on product regulation where SPS doesn't apply. And again, the regulations must be least trade restrictive. Okay, so as the renegotiation process within the WTO has ground to a halt, there's been increasing movement towards bilateral and regional or preferential trade agreements, essentially because of increasing developing country resistance at the WTO, and the drive from the US and the EU in particular for new free trade agreements. In fact, however, the plurilateral agreements are on the go generally. China and India have encouraged bilateral trade agreements and regional trade agreements, and in Latin America, Mercosur is a South-South free trade agreement, and in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN agreement is also essentially a South-South free trade agreement. So this process of this spaghetti pool of new agreements is proceeding. Now, in addition to free trade agreements are the bilateral investment treaties, the first of which was negotiated in 1959, but increasingly the investment agreements, investment provisions are being included in free trade agreements. The Uruguay round did achieve an agreement on trade-related investment measures, or TRIMs, which includes some restrictions with respect to investment, including foreign exchange, control of foreign exchange rules and local content requirements and so forth. But it didn't give everything that the corporations were looking for. And so there was a dramatic proliferation of BITs, bilateral investment treaties, during the 1990s. The corporations sought to include investment under the so-called Singapore issues in the WTO agreements, but were knocked back. And then in the OECD sought to negotiate what was called a multilateral agreement on investment, or MAI, from 1995 to 1998, which would impose, deregulate policy controls over foreign investment. It would include so-called investor-state dispute settlement. This was opposed by networks of civil society organisations, particularly environmental and digital rights associations. The negotiations around MAI were discontinued from 1998. There was an attempt to take the issue back to the WTO, but there was very strong resistance in Seattle. And so investor protection provisions are now being written into plurilateral agreements being negotiated, such as the TPP and the TTIP. Just a brief note then on investor-state dispute settlement. Under the WTO, dispute settlement is between countries, but under the MAI, and it was proposed, and under the some of the existing bilateral investment treaties, there is provision made for investor-state dispute settlement. That means a dispute can be raised by an investor against the state. And one of the current issues is the dispute raised by Philip Morris Asia against Australia for its plain packaging of tobacco regulations, which Philip Morris is claiming it represents a form of expropriation, and that therefore they should be compensated for the expropriation of their intellectual property. Okay, let's just look then at the US free trade agreements, because the US has been the main driver of this process. In terms of pre-2000, there were only a few, and I've listed the NAFTA agreement, which we've talked about before, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and which includes Canada, the US and Mexico, and a free trade agreement with Israel. But since 2000, free trade agreements have been achieved on a bilateral basis with a number of countries, as listed here, and in Central America, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, as listed. At the bottom of this slide, there's a number of free trade initiatives which have in fact lapsed. Most famously, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA, which was rejected by the Latin Americans. Free trade agreements currently being driven by the US include the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, which includes Australia, and the TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which in particular includes the US and Europe. As indicated earlier, there is a TISA agreement, which being negotiated, which started in 2013. This is a reaction to the deadlock within the GATS renegotiation. TISA stands for Trade in Services. And this in fact is being driven by Australia in association with the US. So there's a wide range of free trade agreements on the go, all of which have implications for public health. On this slide I've taken from Third World Resurgence in 2006, we can see the broad pattern of the standard US free trade agreement as it operated in 2006. And I draw attention to the fact that the commitments on agriculture do not include any commitments with respect to anti-dumping or control of agricultural subsidies. The commitments on investment include compensation for indirect expropriation. That's to say, if you do anything which affects the profits of the corporation, you need to compensate them for it, and investor-state dispute settlement, and prohibition of certain performance requirements, such as that if you're going to be allowed to come into this country, you've got to meet these standards. Under intellectual property, the standard US free trade model includes the patentability of plant varieties. It includes patent linkage with respect to drug approval. Now, patent linkage means that the marketing authorities in the country, which in Australia is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, are obligated to check to see whether any new application for marketing approval of it is in fact in breach of an existing patent intellectual property rights. So intellectual property rights which have hitherto been regarded as civil law, in other words, if somebody's taken your rights, you should sue them for satisfaction, becomes essentially has been criminalised by requiring the state to take responsibility for policing and enforcement. The IPR, the intellectual property rights under the US free trade model include data exclusivity, extended patent terms, and so forth. The services approach under the US free trade model includes a negative list approach. In other words, everything is included unless you accept it. It represents a departure from the GATS provision. So let's look at Mexico 10 years post NAFTA. NAFTA was introduced to Mexico with many, many promises. However, 10 years post NAFTA, Mexico was experiencing a 1% growth rate. 2 million farmers had left their land, including many who had allegedly illegally, migrated to the US. They had increased their exports of fruit and veggies, despite anti-dumping actions and SPS barriers, which mainly benefited the commercial farmers in the north of Mexico. But there were dramatic increases in the imports of subsidized corn from the US, which had led to falling prices of corn and loss of livelihood of small farmers. So the 2 million farmers leaving their land, and many of those going to the US, were doing so because dumped corn from the north, from US dumped grains, had made it impossible to continue to farm. By 2005, which is 10 years after NAFTA, Mexico was importing 99% of its soybeans, 80% of rice, 30% of beef, and 30% of beans. So the claim that NAFTA was going to significantly benefit Mexico has not been borne out, although some Mexicans obviously have benefited. Many millions of Mexicans have not in fact benefited. There's a very famous case called Metalclad, which illustrates the problem of investor-state dispute settlement under NAFTA. Metalclad set up a toxic waste dump in Mexico, which was above the drinking water source of the local town. They didn't have a construction permit. The state government stopped Metalclad from operating. Metalclad appealed to NAFTA, and Mexico, in this case the federal government, was required to pay $17 million to Metalclad in compensation. So NAFTA and ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, are clearly problematic. Another free trade agreement which appears to have lapsed was the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, or ACTA. This was signed in 2011, negotiated in secret, driven by Big Pharma and by Big Entertainment. It has only been ratified by Japan. So this is a response to what are perceived by Big Pharma and Big Disney as being the failure of the TRIPS agreement, because it insists on stronger enforcement of wider, easier intellectual property rights. It represents forum shifting after the TRIPS renegotiations stalled, but itself has been stalled because of strong opposition in Europe. The opposition has come from internet users concerned about individual freedoms, from library interests, but very strongly from public health and access to medicines bodies. So ACTA basically shows us that resistance to the corporate agenda is clearly possible and can be successful. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is currently under negotiation, started out in 2005 as the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, or the P4, because it included Brunei, Chile, Singapore and New Zealand. The US joined it and 6 others joined it in 2008, and it changed its name to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The idea is that once it's been finalised, other countries will be encouraged to join it on a take it or leave it basis. They won't be offered the option of participating in the negotiations. The negotiation of the TPP again represents a form of forum shifting after the stalled WTO negotiations. It includes WTO plus provisions with stronger enforcement of easier IPRs, with market-based pharmaceutical pricing. The Americans are proposing that the US is proposing that the use of cost-effectiveness criteria for pricing in reimbursement schemes like Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme would be forbidden, and that market-based pricing would prevail. Now, market-based pricing simply means that if you've got a monopoly on the drug, you can set the price. And this is the system which operates in the US, but that explains why the US has extraordinarily high prices for medicines. The negotiations have been in secret, although shared with around 500 large corporations, and there is increasing opposition to the TPP from public health, from cultural organisations, from digital rights organisations, public interest organisations, and it is not clear that it'll proceed, but watch this space. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Treaty, or partnership, also Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, commenced in 2013, although the lobbying for such an agreement goes way back. Initially it was quite secret, but the leakages and the activism within the European Parliament led to more consultation in Europe than had been the case with the TPP. The TTIP will include services, includes investment, includes ISDS, regulatory coherence and so forth. The opposition is coming from many different interest groups opposed to ISDS because of the loss of regulatory space, the loss of regulatory capacity, the chilling effect of ISDS on regulation. And clearly there has been opposition from access to medicines advocates. So this term WTO plus is a legitimate way of describing a lot of these free trade agreements, that they include conditions which are in excess of what's required by TRIPS in respect of IP, data exclusivity, patent extension, patent linkage and medical procedures. So in other words, the US ambit claim for the TPP is that medical procedures can be patented, that any new use of a drug can be patented. It includes the so-called patent linkage, that the regulatory authority for marketing approval becomes the enforcer of patent rights and so forth. The free trade agreements include pressure on the developing countries to further reduce their tariffs. However, there is continuing refusal to reduce agricultural protection and support and export subsidy. It includes investor protection provisions, as I've described, and a direct attack on government pharmaceutical reimbursement schemes. The new WTO plus provisions do not include special treatment for developing countries. They do not include make provision for making economic development in those countries easier. So the WTO plus movement carry very significant risks for health. Increased IP protection means increased price of medicines. Abolition of cost-effectiveness pricing means that that pharmaceutical procurement and reimbursement will cost more. Acceptance of ISDS will mean much harder to impose regulatory controls in the interests of public health, such as tobacco control or food labelling. There will be a loss of tariff revenues as tariffs are reduced because of the degree to which developing countries often depend upon tariff revenues for government funding. And the WTO plus provisions include significant barriers to economic development. Now, maybe you could be saying, well, this is a very pessimistic view. Surely there are benefits also. Well, we need to ask, what are the benefits, both for Australia or for other countries or for developing countries? And do the benefits outweigh the risks? And can we accept the benefits but reject the risks? How do you negotiate win-win outcomes? So first of all, let's look at the benefits. One of the benefits is increasing export revenues. If we export more goods because we've persuaded others to drop their tariffs, one of the benefits is cheaper imported goods because we've lowered our tariffs, which means that goods which we were paying a lot for have reduced their price. And another benefit is stronger manufacturing, stronger local supply industries because of competitive pressure from exports. It's not always clear that these theoretical benefits are being achieved. We need to look at the process of trade negotiations to think in terms of whether the theoretical benefits are being achieved. To some extent, trade negotiations are driven by theory or ideology that free trade is good, stokes economic growth for all partners, and growth is always good. But in large part, the negotiations are driven by corporations and by industry sectors with specific material interests in the outcomes. In particular, the banks, the manufacturers, foreign-owned corporations such as auto manufacturers, and particular industry sectors. Where there is power asymmetry among negotiating partners, for example, where the US is negotiating with Peru or Vietnam in the TPP context, the power of the less powerful country to exact concessions and to exercise strong legal capacity and analytic capacity may be weak. And the representation of public interest and developing country interests in developing countries may be much weaker than the negotiating skills of the large countries. So what are the implications of all this material we've been covering for public health practice? Well, I think there are three broad implications. One is that public health advocates need to engage in trade policy debate. They need to oppose provisions which directly jeopardize healthcare and public health, both for their own country and for developing countries. Public health advocates need to call for trade policy which promotes a stable, ecologically sustainable global economy, because this has huge implications for health, which promote fair trade and real economic development, including health development. And we need to build a capacity within the public health community to engage effectively in trade policy debate. This implies training, research, and advocacy. In 2006, WHO adopted a resolution on trade and health, which covered many of these issues. I'll jump over this slide and go to the resolution itself. Resolution 5926 on trade and health, which urges countries to, the health ministries in particular countries, to engage with their trade ministry partners to look at the potential challenges that trade and trade agreements may have for health, to establish coordination mechanisms involving ministries of finance, ministries of health, and ministries of trade, and that uses this term coherence to generate coherence in national trade and health policies. In other words, health objectives should not be inconsistent with trade policies. And finally, to develop capacity at the national level to analyse the opportunities and challenges of trade and trade agreements for health. The resolution requested the Director General to provide support to Member States, to respond to Member States' requests for support, and to collaborate with competent international organisations, and that was a reference to the WTO and to WIPO, to support policy coherence between trade and health. This resolution was intensely controversial. The US was furious that it was adopted, and in various mechanisms issued a number of threats to the Secretariat about the degree to which it proceeded down this track. It's also the case that the WHO Secretariat has been increasingly underfunded and is now in a situation where it can only undertake work where it gets donor funding support, and there's been no donor support for the implementation of this legislation, of this resolution, sorry. Okay, so let's look at the public health capabilities which are needed to engage in trade policy. We need trade knowledge. We need knowledge of the various ways in which international trade, investment and finance shape population health, or could shape population health. We need knowledge of regulatory strategies, the methods, the instruments, the institutions for the regulation of trade. We need to be familiar with the language of trade, which is why I've flogged some of the more technical jargon like most favoured nation and national treatment and least restrictive and so forth. We need a capacity for political mobilisation to communicate directly with the constituencies whose health may be at stake in trade negotiations. We need a capacity for broader political engagement to participate in the wider political, economic and ideological conversations within which trade agreements are negotiated. And we need stronger capacity to collaborate between public health advocates in other countries. So what might we do next? Here's some actions which public health people, health activists might take up. We can lobby member states of WHO to increase their untied payments, to free WHO from the chokehold of the big donors, and to implement Resolution A5926. We can urge the development assistance funders to take a more active consideration of the trade-related determinants of health, rather than focusing entirely on vertical disease funding programs. We can ask development assistance funders to look at their national position regarding WHO funding. We can promote research and researcher development and better research funding for issues relating to trade. Longitudinal studies to follow the impact of new trade agreement provisions, longitudinal multi-country studies, tools for trade impact assessment, health impact assessment, etc. We can ensure that MPH graduates, for example, have a basic literacy in relation to trade and health. And we can push our public health associations to build trade and health literacy among public health practitioners, and to continue to advocate around trade-related determinants of health. Okay, now there's a lot of material on the web regarding trade and health, and these three websites would be a good place to start. I urge further browsing. So how should we delve more deeply into these issues? Where should we start our discussion? Are you happy now to be able to describe the ways in which trade relations affect health? Does trade law trump human rights law? If so, why? What are TRIPS flexibilities? Do you recall the discussion of Section 3D of the Indian patent law? Do you think that's a good law? Should it be protected? Should we advocate for Section 3D being replicated in other countries? Or is it a bad law? Is it going to prevent all forms of innovation? What's the significance of this move of trade agreements from the regulation of trade in goods to rules for broader economic integration? What's going on here? Can you describe and explain the 3 challenges to Australia's plain packaging laws? And finally, should public health practitioners be more involved in trade policy formulation? Obviously, I think they should. What do you think? I hope this very long presentation has been of some interest and use for you. Thanks very much.